where we are in Romans is that I was going to read to you a summary that Barrett had written that kind of summed up a lot of where we had been with this, and he says, Paul's argument is in part anthropology. We have already traced his analysis of the human situation, the basic ill of mankind, expressed alike in sheer moral evil. Remember, we've been having Paul just talk about just how terrible and nasty things are and people are. Sheer moral evil in ethical criticism and in the practice of religion is the idolatry of the self in Paul's mind. Man, designed as God's creature to glorify his Creator, chooses rather to glorify himself, and in the end debases himself, because in so doing he contradicts his own essential nature. Obediently or disobediently, he lives under the law. I mean, the law is a given, is what Paul is thinking. He may deliberately throw off the yoke, or alternatively suppose that by doing what he conceives to be right, he can secure his own position by establishing rights over against God. Meaning, if I am good and moral and follow the law and the rules of religion and go to church every Sunday, then I can present my case before God and demand from God to grant me my salvation and let me into heaven and the kingdom of God, because I have earned it. That's the attitude that Paul is saying isn't right. That's not the right attitude and not the right relationship with God. And meaning establishing his rights over and against God. In either case, he is exercising a will to power, which may be described in general terms as a will to power over his environment, or in religious terms as a will to power over God, which can only be harmful because it denies the fundamental insecurity of man's position. Now, the reality is we do try to take control of and manipulate our environment for our safety and comfort and security. The problem for us is that we can never do that completely and securely. I don't know if you've seen any of these science fiction movies where these alien beings come and they've developed their high technology and they can go from star to star and planet to planet, and they've come to Earth to dominate us because they have this power over the environment. And so, how do we defeat them? We don't. They catch the common cold and they die. In spite of all of that power and dominance, they think. And so that's just a classic example of what Paul is arguing here. Anyway, the cure of this ill is faith, which may up to a point be described in terms of the old maxim, know thyself. Man's primary responsibility is to recognize his own place in the universe and to respond to his Creator in grateful and obedient creatureliness. The man who so responds is in harmony with the universe of which he himself, a created constituent of that universe. He does not dominate and control, he's only a part. He is what he was meant to be, and therefore can be at peace. He no longer uses his religion as a means to establish his rights over and against God, but perceives through it that he stands under God's judgment. And instead of thinking to control God's judgment through his own activity and righteousness, accepts it and submits to it and is thereby at peace with God. So this is what we call a relational kind of concept or being in relation to God, but it's an attitudinal thing or a spiritual condition. Anyway, this whole issue of righteousness or being in right relationship with God and restoring or reconciling that relationship with God reminds me, as I said last week, of the Genesis story of the fall of man and woman, being expelled from the garden because the tempter, Dr. Big says the lesson in that story is don't talk to snakes. But the tempter tries to tell them that tree of good and evil, if they could eat of that fruit, they could be like God. And so the subtle crossing the line is not to be like God in the sense of, imitation is the highest form of praise kind of thing, but rather to be equal to and not need God anymore, to be our own God. That subtle shift from emulating out of respect and love from taking control of oneself and separating oneself from God. So anyway, but as the model of parenting, parents want young adults to grow up and become independent, responsible, self-reliant to a healthy degree, but not too soon, and because they have to learn so often the hard way because of immaturity and lack of experience. Last week, you probably heard or read in the paper a really talented and very independent, free spirit, 17-year-old boy from Broken Arrow who was off somewhere on the beach digging a sand cave, and evidently had gone back by himself and crawled in, and it collapsed and he suffocated, and he was found before he died, but they couldn't save him. He did eventually die, but that's what we fear. We want our young people to get out there and try things and learn from experience and develop themselves, but yet there are great risks for harm and damage and loss of life. But all of this kind of raises the question between that sense of blind obedience to whatever we think or perceive is God's will or the law, and then thinking about it and trying to understand what is the spirit of the law, what is the reason for it, because sometimes blind obedience can be counterproductive. It can create mistakes or bad consequences that were not intended. But there's another thought. The other one that in the news where we're looking at obedience and free spirit kind of thing, letter of the law and spirit of the law thing. The 2-year-old that was grabbed by the alligator. There's signs everywhere say don't swim in the water. But yet, as I understand it, the child wasn't really swimming. He was just waiting. So technically, They were following what the sign said, don't swim. But the other part is, now what's the intent of the sign? If you're from Florida, you know what the intent is. Stay away from the water because that's where the alligators are. And they are dangerous. And then the other thing is that when this happened, this was one of the... Karen loves to go to Disney World, and I haven't always gone with them because I don't love Disney World. But anyway... she and Bobby and her mother took a trip and went, and they were at that area. And what they do is they have a movie in the evening outside on the beach where this was happening. So Disney created the situation because the alligators feed at dusk and in the evening. And so they created this dangerous situation for folks from Nebraska that don't understand Florida and alligators. And so this whole question of obedience and following the rules and following the signs, and it takes interpretation and understanding of how this is supposed to work. And so sometimes very strict followings keep us safer, but then sometimes we need to fully understand a literalistic interpretation. The kid wasn't swimming. He was just waiting. So they didn't break the rule of no swimming. They just didn't understand the spirit and the reason for it. Now there's another thought in an ethics book by, I think he was the dean of the School of Philosophy at the University of Kansas. When I was there, I bought this book, and it has some essays in it. And I remember one of the essays was very interesting. It was in regard to our legal system, laws of sentencing, and particularly related to capital punishment, but really all the laws. And it also, in regard to this, it kind of related to this case out in, I guess wherever, California, Stanford, the student athlete, the swimmer who was accused of sexual, it wasn't actually rape, it was, it had another term, assault, sexual assault conviction, and people thought the punishment was way too lenient, and there was just this real strong reaction to that and calling for the judge's dismissal. Anyway, that indicates that there is an undercurrent of feeling that my college professor and dean of the School of Philosophy at KU had written about in this little book that I remembered. And what he was writing about is that there is an undercurrent of feeling in society from the obedient, law-abiding folks in the culture who will require and demand punishment for offenders. We got to have tougher laws. You hear that kind of thing. Longer and mandatory sentences. Or, that should be a capital offense. This person should be killed. Now, sometimes it's punishment, retribution, and then other times it's we've got to teach everybody else a lesson. This is going to be a deterrent. However, anyway, he states that this is not so much from an ethical, philosophical punishment should fit the crime in a logical way kind of reasoning, which would mean the more egregious a sin or bad deed that's hurting somebody that's against the law, then the more severe the punishment should be, that it should fit the crime. But rather, he argued that at a subliminal level, often and unadmitted and sometimes unrecognized by the people feeling and voicing this, motivation for demanding the punishment instead of mercy is that a lot of folks in their own heart of heart are only good and law-abiding themselves out of fear of getting caught. They're really not motivated to be good for goodness sake, but out of fear that if I did it, sure as shooting, I'd get caught and I'd have to be punished. And the only reason I am good is because the threat is there. And if the threat weren't there, I probably wouldn't be good. So we have got to keep that threat strong, and anyone who breaks that law, by golly, they better be punished, or else I might lose control of myself. So this is, like I said, it's not a clearly thought out thing, but kind of a subliminal feeling, attitude in the culture. So if you lessen or weaken the probability of getting caught and weaken the severity of the punishment, they fear that they themselves would be tempted more and might yield to the temptation and do wrong, and then project that idea on the rest of society, that if I'm that way, then others are going to be that way. We have to have this really strong reinforcement. And then an additional attitudinal factor was that those motivated by the fear of punishment to be law-abiding, they were angry and resentful toward those who were guilty who get off. Because, like I said, the thought is, if I do it, I'm going to get caught and I'm going to get punished. And that's not fair for them to get off, But they don't know that. They're just projecting that and thinking and feeling that. So it's not right. It's not right for someone to get away with it. So that's a part of the demand for higher penalties and stronger reinforcement. And if some judge is too lenient, off with his head, or no, that isn't it. It's kick him out of office, get rid of him. That's not right. Well, anyway, like I said, this whole thing, I've thought of that in that Paul, in trying to talk about the death of Jesus as God's act to show that his mercy and not condemning and not punishing the Jewish people before and not calling for this mass annihilation of all the unfaithful at the end time, that he was being too lenient. This whole idea that somehow God is not just or God isn't powerful. God has lost either his sense of justice or lost his power. And so the whole issue of Christ, of Jesus dying on the cross as demonstrating that God has not lost this is what Paul was arguing. And it wasn't that God is such an angry God and God wanted to be appeased, but it was people who have this feeling need to be assured. that God is still in control and that it's okay for God to show mercy and forgiveness. That the whole world isn't falling apart. This whole moral order of the world and society isn't falling apart because God shows us forgiveness and mercy. Does that make sense? Is it hard to swallow? Yeah, it's kind of abstract and, kind of up there. I have to admit, if I had gone to college and followed my strengths, it would have been math and science. But I felt called to the ministry in the 9th grade, and if I was going to be a minister, I needed to build on my weaker areas. So I majored in philosophy and English. And in the philosophy classes, rather than being really up there and, going toe-to-toe with professors and other people in the class, I was trying to grasp those ideas and pull them down and figure them out. It was hard. It was tough. But anyway, that and seminary and a doctoral program kind of helped me grow into some of those things so I can understand them better. Don't know that I understand them well enough to convey them, but anyway. The next part that we go to is the 4th chapter of Romans, where he's been arguing these ideas of righteousness and grace and how are you saved, by works or by God's grace and your faith. And he says, to prove my point, I'm going to lift up the example of Abraham. And so here we go. What then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, to one who works, wages are not reckoned to them as a gift, but as something due. But to one who without works trusts God, who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. So also David speaks of the blessedness of those to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one against whom the Lord will not reckon sin. Is this blessedness then pronounced only on the circumcised or also the uncircumcised, meaning Jew and Greek? We say faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? Well, it was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So the whole idea, he's putting Abraham on common ground with the Greek or Gentile. The purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe without being circumcised, and who thus have righteousness reckoned to them. And likewise the ancestor of the circumcised, who are not only circumcised, but who also follow the example of the faith that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised. So, Barrett and William Barclay both say that Paul turns to Abraham because his opponents, remember he's either in active debate or is remembering all of these debates as he's dictating this letter to the church at Rome, because the opponents, the Jewish folks who don't quite buy his arguments about Jews and Greeks being equal and the justification by faith apart from works, so Paul says, well, we'll just look at Father Abraham as an example, the one whom God chose to work through in order to establish this chosen people. So, on the one hand, why is Abraham, instead of anybody else, the chosen one? What made him special? Well, God chose him, but why? What was in God's mind? Now, that's what Barclay and Barrett are kind of working with, and I read their question, and then it raised a question in my mind that Paul doesn't really raise this possibility, but it is a possibility within the range of all things possible that God just might have spoken to any one or more other people with the same idea. If you will go where I tell you to go and be my instrument and agent, I will make of you a great nation and a great name. If you will. Well, how many people did God offer that to before Abraham said, I will, I volunteer, I'll do it? We don't know. Or it could be argued in God's wisdom, God wasn't going to waste time. God knew who was the one who would answer, and so God went right to him. What do I think? Well, I have told you about my ninth grade Sunday school teacher who we had a question about each one of us. And if we felt like God was calling us to be God's instrument and to stand up and do something in the midst of the world, the church, the community. And if we didn't have enough faith, were too lazy, didn't trust that it was God who was nudging us or calling us, and we did not do it, could we thwart God's will for that good to be done? Would it never get done because we failed to respond? Can we block God's will by our faithlessness? Well, her answer was no. God will find somebody else. However, the reality is if we responded first and quickly, it's possible that the good could have gotten started earlier and grown and developed into something much bigger than what had to happen later when someone finally responded. Or we might have been the best choice and would have been more effective because of our own gifts and graces and abilities. But God had to take second choice or third choice who had more faith but maybe didn't have the gifts and talent and ability to do it well. Possibly, if someone would have had the courage. Yeah. Well, one of the things that another thing in this playing with the idea of how much control does God have over history, and how much does God rely on and depend upon us. That one of the things of special and big events happening, and we'll call it a God thing sometimes, is at the right place at the right time. One, that Christ came at this particular time when the Roman Empire was in power, and that Paul responded as a diaspora Jew, and that they did have, even though it was an authoritarian and an oppressive Pax Romana, but yet they had the roads and the communication and the Greek language that allowed the faith to spread so rapidly. And it's, it's kind of like a fire. Sometimes when like out at your place, when everything is so dry and it gets started, all of the combustible material is there and it just takes over and overpowers. Well, if all the combustible faith and spiritual material was there when the spark of Christianity hits that time and that place to spread, then how much of it is God controlling or seizing the opportunity? Making an extra effort to get through to somebody. Sometimes it's a question. We have to ask, or don't have to ask, but can ask in this regard. But anyway, like I said, my Sunday school teacher had asked that question of us, and she wasn't trying to give us an excuse for not being faithful and responding, but oh my gosh, we had in that Sunday school class there were so many of us in the class were honor students in high school, and were really hungering and questioning and challenging, and she was an excellent teacher, and really opened things up and pushed us to think things through. But that there are some people in trying to motivate folks will try to lay guilt trips on folks. And part of it is, if you don't do this, somehow you're going to let God down, and the whole world is going to go to hell in a handbasket because you didn't do something. And sometimes you don't really feel called to do that. That's someone trying to lay a guilt trip on you. And if you're young and immature and they've told you that they're God's spokesperson, and they feel like God is telling them that you're the one, and then that's and sometimes people do that at churches with finance campaigns for some project. And there will be people who say, that project is ill-advised. You know, it doesn't make good business sense, or it's really not the right direction the church should be going. And I remember I inherited a big fight that had never gotten resolved at the church at Ada, that they really needed more education classrooms, but they had overbuilt. Did I ever tell you this story, that when they had the fundraising campaign, speaking of that, they had a fundraising campaign, and, you know, they called in an expert, you know, consultant and fundraiser, and in these programs, and it's psychology, but it's also spirituality and leadership and that sort of thing, called in some of the more wealthy folks and asked them to pray about giving a leadership gift. And they had suggested that you know, they pray about it, and if they're willing to do it when they had the big meeting, you know, to call every dinner and people are going to make their speeches and pledges, that they'd give up and give a testimony that they're going to give a leadership gift, and want them to think about $5,000 because they need to build a new sanctuary. So that was down in the oil patch, and there were these three families that happened to be big oil folks. And so the night came, and the first one got up and said, my wife and I have been praying about this, and we've decided that we're going to give a special gift, and we'll give $50,000, and we will match anybody who gives more. Well, the second one and the third one, they're talking to their wife or spouse, and then the next one gets up and says, well, we've been praying about it, and we've decided we will give $75,000, and we will match anybody who gives more. Well, the third one gets up. We've prayed about it, and we will give $100,000, and we'll match anybody who gives more. And the poor pastor is thinking, anybody else? But anyway, they started off with $300,000, and they built an 800-seat nice oak wood sanctuary on a kind of Romanesque or Gothic style. And but the problem is they way overbuilt. You know, the town wasn't going to grow that big, and so it's became kind of a liability. But later on, they needed more education rooms, but one family wanted to give a lot of money, but they would only give it if they would build a small chapel that, like our Rose Chapel, would seat about 100, and name it after the family. Well, that's what was done because they had the money to do it. But the educational part, it was a lot of young families, and they didn't have the money to outbid. So there was this contention that, you know, we built that thing and we don't need it. What a waste. And how arrogant of that family to force us to do that, because they didn't pay for the whole thing. You know, it was just the leader's big amount. But one, and then there's, well, anyway, there's a group of people got mad because they had two services, and one of the former pastors, who was, I think he was right before me, had told them on Easter Sunday, we got to quit having 2 services. It divides our numbers. And, we got this huge sanctuary, and it doesn't look good to not be full. And so on Easter Sunday, we're going to not do the early service, and we're going to have everybody gather at the second service. So they all cooperated, and they did that. But then he never went back and did the early service anymore. And the early service folks were upset and angry. And a lot of them were faithful every Sunday worshipers, but they had their set time at the golf course at 11. They'd come to church, and then they'd go golf. Well, if you're going to take away my early service, I'm not going to give up my golf. So we lost a bunch of regular attenders. So I told them when I came, I'll make a deal with you. If we will never have less than 50 in attendance at the early service, it'll be worth our time and effort. I have the organist. I'll be there, and we'll have a service. To this day, it has not dropped under 50. In fact, I have about 100 or more. And we did it in the chapel to use it. Because when I was at annual conference, I'd met the business administrator, and they'd had horrible news that they had found this huge amount of damage behind the altar in the chapel that was hardly ever used. Termites were eating up all the expensive woodwork. So if we've got it, we better utilize it. So we started the 8 o'clock or 8:30 service again and utilized it and paid attention. But anyway, where was I? We got all off track. I had another analogy of how God can work, or how does God work from nature. We see, and in the creation story, God's telling the birds and the animals, and we assume it also applies to the plants and then to human beings, be fruitful and multiply. Any of you have a pin oak tree, maple tree, redbud tree? Are they mature? Do they have acorns and little helicopter seeds? Well, if the species to survive depended upon only one seed being produced in the lifetime of the mature tree, they would go extinct. God's will for the species to multiply and to fill the earth and create forests couldn't be fulfilled. So we have all of these seeds, millions and millions of seeds, and we're having to pull them up all the time where they don't belong. But anyway, if that was from nature, if that's God's plan, then maybe in human communities and the life of the world, then God doesn't depend upon one to work His will, but hopes that many will. And rather than just one doing it, if we have a group, if they all respond, then things can move faster and be accomplished better. Anyway, back to Paul and his use of Abraham to illustrate his point about justification by God's grace and human faith, or being saved by faith. With Abraham, Paul shows us that his new idea, so to speak, is not a new idea, but it's actually foundational. It's foundational in Judaism. His idea is not heretical, but it's at the core of the Abrahamic covenantal faith. So Paul reminds the Jews that when God came to Abraham and asked him to go to a land I will show you, Abraham responded with faith and trust in God. He didn't question or challenge or ask for prior proof before he would act in faith, but he had the faith and the trust before he took the action, or he wouldn't have taken the action. Before he started gathering up his things and gathering up his family and packing and preparing for the journey, he had the faith first. And obviously this was long before the laws of Moses that made him know how to be faithful and obedient and righteous, because there weren't the rules yet. And so he hadn't proved himself as being obedient to the law, because there was no law, letter of the law to be obedient to. So, and as we studied, he did some things that were questionable in his relationship with Sarai and Hagar and anyway, all those things. We saw that he hadn't matured, so God didn't choose him because he was perfect. So all of this was before the circumcision was required, and so Abraham put his faith in God's promise that God would show him this land. And then the promises of being a great nation were kind of secondary. He had to get there first, and he stepped out and went. Now the rabbis and the Jewish scholars put their focus and attention on the response of the faith that moves one into action and allows and creates the opportunity for the promise then to be fulfilled. It's both, but they were putting their emphasis on the second part, and Paul's putting his emphasis on the first part. Now, Abraham, and to draw an example with some Christian folks, Abraham could have equated his faith with simply believing in God's existence and feeling special with God, with experiencing God's visiting him. He could have stayed in Haran and spent the rest of his life telling about his great encounter with the Almighty God, the Creator of the universe, who had come to him and had talked to him. He could have had that experience, and he could have just tried to live on that experience. But his faith and trust really needed to be completed with believe, trust, and then follow. Do what God asked you to do. Now, the distinction that Paul is making is he makes with this word counted when he talks about the worker earning his pay or salary. Counted, or reckoned is the word in NRV. But anyway, that a worker does the job and has earned the pay. Now, someone's sitting on their can and not getting up and doing the work, if someone reckoned or counted them as having done the job and then gave them the same amount of money, well, that one hadn't earned it. It was a gift. But the one who did the work earned it and had a right to it. So he's using that, but in terms of the righteousness, the one who didn't do the work hadn't gotten calluses on the hands and hadn't gotten strength in the body from doing the work, but they were just treated as if they'd been a worker. And Jesus had a parable about that. Who goes to work early in the day and at the latter of the day? And what does the person need? Well, they would need a living wage. They need to feed their family. It was minimal, amount. And so God cares about you, and you don't have to earn that love and care, is what Paul is trying to say. And that is used up our time. So let us pray. Dear God, we do thank you for revealing to us through Paul and his fighting with the folks who didn't want to accept your way of doing things through mercy and grace, and helping us understand that we are recipients of that. And so help us be gracious and appreciative, and then to try to be worthy of it, and to try to demonstrate that quality of love and care and mercy and grace in our relations with others. Amen and amen. Colette Johns is going to be the Sunday school lesson, and she comes and she's had a life in the Jewish faith, but she and her husband attend here, and she's going to talk about the Jewish personal God. And so she's always got interesting comments to me after class and different times. So I think she'll have some good things to share with you all. So that'll be the 3rd. Yeah, Ken will be here next Sunday. And I'll send him an extra message. I was going to send him a message this week. And thank you, sir.